until I found something inside that no one was supposed to see. Before we start, join our YouTube family by subscribing to the channel. Now, let's get into the story. I never imagined a simple trip to the rural auction would change my life. I had grown up in a city where everything felt planned and predictable, where the rhythm of life was dictated by traffic lights and office clocks. But that Saturday, something inside me whispered that I needed to do something different. Maybe it was the clear, cool air brushing over the open fields as I stepped out of my car, or the quiet anticipation that hummed beneath the chatter of the farmers and townsfolk gathered at the edge of the auction grounds. I wasn't a collector or someone who delighted in old things, but something about the dusty auction tables, the worn furniture, and the mismatched tools seemed alive, as if each item had a story that nobody cared to tell anymore. The auctioneer's voice echoed across the yard, sharp and brisk, rattling off numbers and bids. Most people were there for the obvious treasures: a new tractor, bags of hay, crates of preserved vegetables. But my attention was drawn to a small, nearly forgotten shed tucked into the far corner, its peeling paint and crooked door almost camouflaged against the overgrown grass. I noticed that the wood looked weathered but solid, and the rusty hinges suggested it had survived decades of storms and neglect. Something in me recognized resilience in that little building, a stubbornness that refused to vanish despite years of being overlooked. It was almost as if the shed itself had a pulse, a quiet insistence that it had something to show, if only someone would care to see it. The other bidders barely glanced at it. Most of them laughed when the auctioneer mentioned the shed in passing. "You'll regret that one, son," said an older farmer with a straw hat that shaded his sun-darkened face. His eyes crinkled with amusement as he shook his head. I smiled politely, pretending not to care, though I felt a spark of curiosity that refused to fade. There was no competition for it. I raised my hand almost on impulse, more as a gesture than a serious bid. My heart pounded as the auctioneer's gavel came down, and suddenly, just like that, the shed was mine for $5. The simplicity of it was shocking. The shed, ignored by everyone else, had cost me less than a cup of coffee in the city, yet it felt like I had stumbled across something far more valuable than anything money could buy. Dragging the shed back to my property was harder than I expected. I had underestimated the weight, and the uneven terrain made the old wheels groan under the strain. Sweat ran down my back, stinging my eyes, but I didn't mind. Each step felt like progress, not just in moving a shed, but in moving toward something unknown. It was as if the effort itself was a promise, a preparation for whatever awaited inside. When I finally propped the shed against a flat patch of grass behind my modest home, I stepped back and studied it. The sun glinted off the old nails and splintered wood, highlighting cracks and knots that whispered secrets of years gone by. I could almost hear the faint creak of the door swinging in some long-forgotten breeze, and for a moment, I wondered who had built it, who had used it, and what had been kept within its walls before it ended up abandoned at an auction. I spent the rest of the afternoon clearing the overgrown weeds around it. As I worked, memories of my childhood stirred days spent exploring my grandmother's barn, crawling through dusty attics and discovering old letters, broken tools, and forgotten heirlooms. That sense of wonder had never left me. Though life in the city had buried it under responsibilities and routines, the shed seemed to beckon me back to that feeling, that quiet thrill of discovery. And I realized something important. I had been craving this kind of adventure without even knowing it. There was no map, no instructions, only curiosity, and that tiny spark of courage that had led me to bid on something everyone else dismissed. Night fell, and the shed stood silently in the fading light, its shadow stretching across the grass, like a reminder that the story had only just begun. I imagined the creaks and whispers of old floors and walls, the dust dancing in shafts of moonlight, as if the air itself was holding memories, waiting to be uncovered. My mind wandered to the possibilities. What if the shed held nothing but cobwebs and broken shelves? I reminded myself that even then, the act of discovery mattered. But deep down, a quiet voice inside me insisted there was more. Something hidden, something valuable in a way that transcended money or material worth. As I went to bed that night, I could not sleep. My thoughts were tangled with images of that small shed, the cracked wood, the rusty nails, the promise it seemed to carry, I imagined the effort it would take to clean it, organize it, and perhaps open it. There was a thrill in that anticipation, a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in years. I realized that I was no longer just a city dweller on a whim. I had become an explorer of my own life, a seeker of truths that hid in plain sight. That small decision raising my hand for a $5 shed had shifted something inside me. It wasn't just about the shed anymore. It was about daring to notice the overlooked, to find meaning where others only saw junk. The next morning, I awoke before sunrise, energized and eager. I could hear the birds singing in the distance, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the quiet hum of a world that seemed suddenly richer, more vivid. I grabbed a flashlight, my gloves, and a crowbar, and approached the shed with a mix of excitement and nervousness. I had no idea what I would find inside, and that uncertainty made my pulse quicken. Each step toward it felt like stepping into another world, one where every plank of wood, every cobweb, and every layer of dust might hold a secret left behind decades ago. I knelt by the old latch, feeling its rough edges under my fingers, and took a deep breath. The darkness inside seemed impenetrable at first. But as I shone the flashlight around, I saw the outlines of boxes stacked neatly against the walls, tools hung with precision, and something else, something that made my heart skip a beat. The shed was not empty. It had been preserved almost like a time capsule, untouched for years, and I felt a sudden, almost reverential sense that I was intruding on a world someone had carefully arranged, waiting for the right person to notice it. I stepped inside cautiously, the wooden floor creaking beneath my weight. Dust motes floated in the light, and the air smelled of dry earth and old wood. I reached for one of the boxes and blew off the thick layer of dust, revealing a handwritten label. My curiosity piqued. I opened it slowly, expecting perhaps old tools or papers. What I found instead made me pause, staring in disbelief at the neatly stacked contents. There, hidden inside the first box, were journals, their leather covers cracked with age, each carefully tied with string. They seemed to belong to someone who had lived long ago, and their very presence inside this abandoned shed hinted at stories that had been forgotten, stories waiting patiently for someone to discover them. A shiver ran down my spine, a bridge between the past and the present. I understood that I had just taken my first step into a mystery that would challenge my understanding of the world. That $5 shed, laughed at by everyone else, was about to reveal a history far richer than I could have imagined. And the thought that the adventure was only beginning, and I had no idea where it would lead me next. The morning after discovering the journals, to step into the life of the person who had written them and uncover what had been hidden for so long, I set a small folding chair in the corner, brushed away the last bits of dust, and arranged the journals neatly on the floor in front of me. And the pages were thin, the ink faded, but still legible. Holding them, I felt connected to someone I had never met, a woman named Clara, who had lived on this land decades ago, long before I was born. As I opened the first journal, I was struck by the simplicity of her early entries. Clara wrote about ordinary things: planting beans and corn, tending chickens, cleaning the house, baking bread. Each sentence was deliberate, careful, almost as if she were speaking directly to someone who would come after her. A rhythm to her observations that made even the most mundane chores feel alive. Chickens that didn't wander off. There was a patience and a dignity in her life that I had never known in my own fast-paced, always in thuggo existence. But soon, the tone of the journals shifted. The mundane entries gave way to something far stranger. Strange visitors who would knock on the door and leave just as suddenly. At first, I thought perhaps she was exaggerating, letting imagination creep into her storytelling. But as I read further, the details became too specific, the patterns too consistent to dismiss, grounded in the land, the people, and the history of the town. Every detail she provided was a break, leading someone willing to follow it to truths long forgotten. I spent hours poring over the journals. It was like solving a puzzle. Every note about a missing neighbor seemed to connect in a way I couldn't yet understand. A part of me wondered if I had bitten off more than I could chew. Who was I to follow clues left by someone who had lived decades before me? And yet, another part of me, one I had long ignored, felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. The challenge thrilled me. It was a test of patience, of curiosity, of my ability to pay attention to the overlooked and the subtle. By mid-afternoon, I had uncovered something remarkable. Tucked into one of the back pages of a journal was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and brittle at the edges. It was a sketch of a trapdoor beneath the shed floor, with instructions written in Clara's careful handwriting. According to her notes, she had hidden a collection of letters and photographs underneath, carefully preserved for someone who might one day seek them out. My pulse quickened. This was the first real clue that the shed held something beyond memories and journals. It was a tangible mystery, waiting for me to unlock it. The idea that Clara had planned this discovery decades ago, anticipating a future seeker, sent shivers down my spine. I gathered my courage and tools and carefully pried up the loose floorboard she had described. The wood groaned under my weight, and dust filled the air as I shifted it aside, revealing a small, shallow cavity. Inside were envelopes stacked neatly, each labeled with names and dates. I picked up the top envelope and read the faded handwriting. The letters told stories of the town I thought I knew. Disputes over land, lost friendships, unspoken rivalries, and quiet acts of kindness that had never been recognized. Each envelope was like a window into lives that had vanished from memory, connecting families, neighbors, and friends in ways that nobody alive remembered. I realized that this hidden collection was more than a curiosity. It was a record of a town's soul, its secrets, and its history, preserved by someone who had cared enough to ensure it wasn't lost forever. As I worked through the letters, I began to see a pattern. Clara had documented conflicts over farmland, disagreements over inheritance, and forgotten acts of generosity that shaped the community in ways unnoticed by official records. She had chronicled the movements of people who had mysteriously left town, leaving questions unanswered for decades. Some of the letters revealed betrayals. Others detailed reconciliations that had never been publicly acknowledged. Each story added depth and complexity to the town's history, and as I read, I began to reflect on my own life. I had lived all these years as a passive observer, letting time pass without noticing the quiet struggles and triumphs of those around me. Clara's meticulous care reminded me that every life matters. Every decision leaves a trace, and sometimes the smallest acts can echo through decades. One envelope in particular caught my attention. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to anyone. In the past, it was labeled simply, "For the Finder." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a note written in Clara's familiar, careful handwriting. It was addressed to someone she had never met, explaining her hope that a curious, careful person would one day discover the shed, the journals, and the letters. She wrote about the lessons she had learned, the mistakes she had made, and the joys she had experienced living a simple life in the heart of the land. Her words were intimate and reflective, almost as if she knew that by the time I read them, I would understand not just her story, but my own life better. The note ended with a simple, almost teasing line: "The shed has more to show you. Look closer, and the past will reveal itself." That sentence ignited a fire in me. I felt a surge of excitement, mixed with a deep, almost reverent responsibility. Clara had trusted that the person who discovered her secrets would be careful, patient, and attentive. She had left me a path to follow, a challenge to piece together the hidden truths of the town, and perhaps to reconcile the past with the present. I realized that this journey wasn't just about uncovering history, it was about growing as a person, learning to see the value in details, in patience, and in curiosity. Each discovery was teaching me something fundamental about attention, empathy, and the courage to seek answers, even when they might challenge everything I thought I knew. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I was exhausted but exhilarated. My hands were dusty, my back sore, and my mind buzzing with questions and possibilities. Yet I felt profoundly alive, more connected to the land, the town, and the generations that had come before me than I had ever felt before. The shed, which had seemed like a simple, forgotten structure, had transformed into a portal and entrance, into a story far larger than I could have imagined. And as I stepped out into the fading light, I looked back at the shed and knew that what I had discovered was only the beginning. There were still layers to uncover, secrets buried under dust and time, and perhaps even a truth that might change how the town and I understood our place in it. That night, I lay awake thinking about what I had found. The voices of the past whispering through the pages of the journals and letters. I realized that this was more than a mystery. It was a connection across time, A reminder that life's stories don't end, they wait, sometimes quietly, for someone willing to listen. And just as I was drifting into sleep, a thought crossed my mind that made my pulse quicken. What if Clara had left one final secret, something she hadn't written down, waiting to be discovered, only by someone patient enough to follow her trail to the very end? By the time I reached the final set of letters, the light outside had begun to fade, casting long shadows through the open shed door. I hadn't realized how many hours had passed. My hands were dusty, my back stiff, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. Clara's words had pulled me into a world I didn't know existed. A world where small decisions shaped entire lives, where quiet actions left marks that lasted for generations. I sat still for a moment, letting everything sink in. The shed was no longer just wood and nails. It had become something far more, a place where the past had been carefully preserved, waiting for someone to understand it. But Clara's last note still lingered in my thoughts. She had said there was one final truth, something hidden in plain sight. I hadn't found it yet, and I could feel it pulling me deeper. I stood up and began to look around the shed again, this time more carefully than before. I ran my hands along the walls, pressed against the wooden panels, and examined the corners. Everything seemed ordinary at first. The tools, the boxes, the journals, they were all accounted for. But then I noticed something subtle. One section of the back wall looked slightly different. The wood grain didn't quite match the rest, and the nails were newer, though still old enough to blend in. Carefully, I pushed against it. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a bit more pressure, the panel shifted slightly. My heart started pounding. I grabbed the crowbar and gently worked the edge loose. The wood creaked, resisting at first, then slowly gave way. Behind it was a small hidden space, barely large enough to fit a box. Inside sat a narrow wooden case, plain and unmarked. It wasn't fancy, but it had been placed there with intention. I lifted it out and set it on the floor, wiping away the dust. For a moment, I just stared at it, feeling the weight of everything I had already discovered. This had to be the final piece Clara had been pointing toward. The lid opened easily. Inside were a few documents, folded neatly. Along with a small bundle of photographs, I picked up the papers first. They were official records, land deeds, agreements, and handwritten notes explaining them. As I read, the truth slowly unfolded. Decades ago, several families in the town had been involved in a complicated arrangement over land. There had been confusion, mistakes, and decisions made in haste. One family had ended up losing property that, according to these documents, had never truly belonged to someone else. The error had never been corrected. Instead, it had been quietly ignored, buried over time as people moved on or passed away. But Clara had known. She had gathered proof, kept records, and hidden them here, not to cause trouble, but to preserve the truth so that one day someone could understand what really happened. I set the papers down and picked up the photographs. My breath caught as I recognized some of the faces. They weren't just people from the past. They were connected to families still living here. Some were neighbors I saw every week. Others were names I had heard in passing but never paid much attention to. Everything suddenly felt closer, more real. This wasn't just history, it was something that still mattered. The past hadn't disappeared. It had simply been forgotten. At the bottom of the case, there was one last envelope. Unlike the others, it had no name on it, just a single line written across the front. "Read this last." I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside was a short letter from Clara. She wrote that she had spent years collecting these pieces, not because she wanted to expose anyone, but because she believed the truth should never be completely lost. She understood that people make mistakes, that life is complicated, and that sometimes the past is left behind for a reason. But she also believed that understanding those mistakes could help people grow, forgive, and move forward. Her final words stayed with me. Whoever finds this must decide what to do next. Truth is powerful, but so is kindness. Choose carefully. I sat there in silence, holding the letter. For the first time since I had opened the shed, I didn't feel excitement or curiosity. I felt responsibility. This wasn't just a discovery anymore. It was a choice. I could take these documents and reveal everything. Bringing old mistakes into the light, it might answer questions, settle disputes, maybe even change lives. But it could also reopen wounds, create tension, and disturb the peace that people had built over the years. Or I could keep it quiet, preserving the truth without letting it cause harm, sharing it only where it might help rather than hurt. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the quiet around me. The wind moved softly through the grass outside. The shed creaked gently, as if reminding me of its long silence. I realized then that Clara hadn't left me a mystery to solve. She had left me a lesson to learn. Carefully, I placed everything back into the wooden case. I didn't rush. Every movement felt important, deliberate. I wasn't just putting things away, I was deciding how to carry this forward. As I stepped outside, the sky had turned a deep orange, fading into dusk. I looked back at the shed, the same small, worn structure everyone had laughed at. It didn't look special from the outside. It still didn't, but I knew better now. That $5 shed hadn't given me treasure or riches. It had given me something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of people, of time, and of the quiet weight of truth. In the days that followed, I shared parts of what I found, carefully and thoughtfully. Not everything only. What could help? What could bring clarity without causing harm? Some stories brought people closer. Others answered questions that had lingered for years. And some things I chose to leave in the shed, because not every truth needs to be loud to matter. Sometimes it's enough that someone finally knows.